Surely we can give a better round of applause to the Permanent Secretary, who is officially opening the forum. And just before I invite our next speaker, allow me recognize these organizations that are represented here in this room this morning. The Africa Development Bank, we want to thank you very much for joining us this morning. Another round of applause, ladies and gentlemen. The Uganda Revenue Authority and Uganda Investment Authority are both represented here. Give them a round of applause, ladies and gentlemen. We have Uganda Development Bank, who are represented here. The academia represented Makerere University, MUBS, and Chambogo University. Our think tank APRC, the Economic Policy Research Center, and of course the UN Development Program, UNDP, that are also represented here in this room. We want to thank you for joining us this morning. Our next speaker is the Executive Director of the IGC and an Associate Professor of Economics at LSE. He was the Founding Director of the Center for Research into Economics and Finance in Southern Africa, which was established at the LSE in 1990 as an initiative of the Commonwealth Heads of Government to support the democratic transition in South Africa. He has advised several African governments with a focus on tax and regulatory issues, and he has served as the Chief Academic Advisor on Taxation and the UK Government Economic Service. Ladies and gentlemen, that is me cutting short Dr. Jonathan Lipp's profile. Welcome with me with a round of applause our next speaker and the Executive Director, IGC.
It's a great pleasure to add my welcome on behalf of the International Growth Centre to this 7th High-Level Economic Growth Forum. Let me extend a special thanks to the PSST and to the Commissioner of Macro, who have been instrumental in their leadership and commitment to this event, not just this year, but in the past as well, which IGC is very proud to support. The Economic Growth Forum brings together researchers and policymakers and key stakeholders to discuss a set of issues that are crucial to Uganda's social-economic transformation. Over the next day and a half, researchers will share their findings and policymakers will be sharing their insights, all with the aim of inspiring evidence-based solutions to the pressing challenges. It's precisely this bringing together of research and policy that the IGC was founded to foster. For those of you who don't know much about the IGC, very briefly, we're a global research centre based at the London School of Economics in partnership with Oxford University, and we have resident country teams across Africa, South Asia, and the Middle East. In seeking to promote inclusive and sustainable growth, governments face a continuously evolving set of policy challenges. And the overarching aim of the IGC is to help governments learn faster. Through long-term partnerships, we've been in Uganda since 2011 and in most of our countries for more than 10 years, but also through a sharp focus on robust academic research. Such research can provide both robust evidence on what works and what doesn't work, which helps governments to make policies that will be effective but also less costly. But research can also provide new ways of thinking about policy challenges and can sometimes reframe questions in a way that open up new policy options. It is testimony to the Ugandan government's commitment to using robust evidence and to being open to new ideas to help drive policy innovation that the Ministry of Finance has convened this forum here today. The agenda for the forum is focused on key economic challenges facing Uganda, and let me just touch on some of those ideas now. I think we're all aware that global conditions, while improving, still present unusually high risks of external shocks. And this demands a focus on building resilience into Uganda's growth path. Although global supply chains and trade and demand are slowly recovering from the pandemic and from the external shocks that we've all faced in its wake, the conflict in Ukraine in particular, these risks have not disappeared. Regional events such as the brutal war in South Sudan, the coup in Niger, and instability in South Sudan and in Ethiopia have added to these complexities. The Bank of Uganda has navigated these shocks effectively, preventing the surge in inflation from translating into second-round effects, as we've all seen for the most recent drop in inflation. But in a slower-growing world and region, Uganda needs to place the infrastructure and the collaborative trade institutions to support export growth and to improve its domestic investment climate and pay attention to its image abroad so as to foster the highest level of economic activity. Sound monetary and economic policy will continue to be crucial to manage this period. Building resilience into Uganda's growth also means diversifying exports, adding local value to commodities, and developing the services sector. With the Ministry of Finance and other partners in government, the IGC is currently launching projects aimed at identifying the obstacles that prevent multinational companies and exporters from connecting to smaller local suppliers, with the aim of helping to design programs that can overcome those obstacles. Key to managing the macroeconomy in this period and a stable path towards deficit reduction will be domestic revenue mobilization, which will be the subject of the second session today. Mobilizing government revenues is essential to finance public services and public investment, also, of course, to reduce the public debt and to reduce reliance on development assistance over time. Uganda's debt is 48.2% of GDP, and yet its revenue is only 13.9% of GDP, which is below average for countries of Uganda's size and income. The government is therefore in the next year or so going to have to resort to difficult fiscal consolidation to ensure that the scarce resources are going to the most efficient use. Given Uganda's diminishing fiscal space from fiscal consolidation and the substantial debt obligations, raising revenue will be essential to enabling policymakers to continue to make growth-enabling investments. One key priority, and we discussed this yesterday in a very productive meeting at the URA, is to continue to increase compliance and enforcement, which is important not just in raising revenue, but also in continuing to broaden the base of taxpayers and to improve the fairness of the tax system. Another important area where the Ministry of Finance has been leading the way is to increase revenue by reducing tax incentives. Research by the ministry has shown that the amount of revenue foregone from tax incentives has increased by 80% in the last 5 years. Beyond these macro management issues, a third vital challenge is how to boost exports and in particular firm productivity. Recent research has shown that Uganda's export performance lags that of its comparator countries. And we know from recent research that connecting more companies to the export markets raises their productivity and is a powerful engine for productivity growth. Export expansion can be realized both through the development of new export markets, but also through the diversification of exported products, both of which are part of the current strategy. Although Uganda continues to rely heavily on unbeneficiated products such as raw agricultural exports, there has in recent years been some success in moving into higher value projects such as the agro-processed manufacturers. Uganda can make further progress through value addition in food and agrochemicals, through exploiting opportunities offered by the implementation of the African Continental Free Trade Agreement. Another important point is that access to imported inputs can be very important for firms wanting to export. Some IGC research has found that importing firms are 20% more likely to export than their counterparts. And Uganda's important agricultural sector depends heavily on imported inputs such as pesticides. Investing in skill development is critical to creating jobs and increasing firm productivity. But evaluations must be built into such investments because research suggests that most such training programs fail to achieve their objectives. Climate change is presenting a new set of challenges. It's intensifying extreme weather events in Uganda that will increasingly damage infrastructure, disrupt supply chains, and reduce productivity across a range of sectors. Flooding, drought, and heat stress are all critical risks for Uganda and will have severe economic effects. Kampala is among the areas most vulnerable to flooding. The cattle corridor is the area most affected by drought. And heat stress will have devastating effects on agriculture and on labor productivity more broadly. According to World Bank estimates, flooding already affects more than 50,000 Ugandans each year, with losses in the millions of dollars. The droughts back in 2010-2011 caused economic losses estimated at $1.2 billion, a staggering 7.5% of GDP. Rising temperatures and shifting rainfall patterns will make optimal growing seasons shorter and increasingly unpredictable. This will reduce the proportion of food crops such as cassava, maize, millet, and groundnuts, with losses projected to reach up to $1.5 billion by 2050, then about 3% of GDP. It will also reduce the critical export of Arabica coffee, potentially by up to 50% by 2050, and with it, the crucial value addition opportunities. Next month, the IGC will publish a white paper on sustainable growth, which argues that we must look at these challenges of climate change through the lens of growth and productivity. Historically, economic development has shifted individuals from unproductive subsistence activities all the way to specialized productive employment in medium and large companies, generating spectacular increases in living standards, but at the cost of significant degradation of the natural environment. This paper argues that innovation, not just in technology, but in institutions, in organizations, in regulations, and in politics, has already dramatically reduced this historical trade-off between growth and the natural environment. But much more progress is needed. The paper also argues that socio-economic transformation, which is at the heart of Uganda's economic strategy, is central to achieving sustainable and inclusive growth. Not only is transformation essential to eliminating poverty and raising living standards, as the PS emphasized when we spoke earlier this week, but shifting individuals from subsistence activities into waged employment is the best way to take them out of harm's way. It is the single most effective form of adaptation and increasing resilience. But sustainable growth also requires large investments in clean energy, in clean transport, and in services more broadly. These are needed both in urban areas, which are where productivity growth is growing most quickly, but also in rural areas where many of the poorest and most vulnerable individuals live. Job upgrading and increases in the productivity of companies will also be critical. And both programs in skill creation, but also programs that help workers and companies find each other more efficiently, will be important as part of this process. And the government itself must also innovate. It must innovate particularly in the area of social protection to help protect households which now face a greater set of risks. And finally, finance. International climate finance is urgently needed, and the Special Climate Finance Unit, recently set up in MUFPED, is an important step. But increased domestic tax and non-tax revenues will also be essential to funding these investments necessary to support Uganda's green transition. As we'll talk about in the first session tomorrow, technology is going to be crucial to Uganda's growth path. Building the knowledge economy and the services sector, which are central to the government's economic strategy, will be crucial in driving productivity growth more broadly, and also in stimulating job creation. Recent IGC and World Bank work has shown that services, from business services to financial services to tourism and elsewhere, can generate jobs that are just as productive as manufacturing. And already some 30% of Uganda's exports are in services. But ICT adoption is still very low in Uganda. According to a study by the Uganda Communications Commission, for example, less than 0.5% of MSMEs currently use advanced technologies capable of being monitored remotely through the internet. To close this technological divide, new approaches are needed. One important focus is skill development, as noted above, where we need experimentation to identify which interventions will be most effective. Another important focus is strengthening the linkages between domestic suppliers and foreign firms to facilitate knowledge spillovers. Making growth fully inclusive requires that policy addresses the barriers that trap people in subsistence activities, and especially in rural areas. The government's launched its multi-sectoral strategy, the Parish Development Model, in February 2022. And one key aim of the strategies is to facilitate the transition of Ugandan households that are in the subsistence economy into the money economy. As noted above, this is a crucial step in increasing Ugandans' growth and living standards, and in making households more resilient to shocks. It's important not to stop with that first step, but to continue to press to enable individuals to move into waged employment and into bigger and bigger firms, because we know from experience in other countries that that will continue to then raise living standards. Upgrading infrastructure will be vital to connect farmers to regional and international markets. The government will also need to ramp up electrification. Currently, only 45% in 2021, 45% of Uganda's population had access to electricity, and only about 36% in rural areas. Recent research has shown that for electrification to have its full benefits in new company creation and job creation, there needs to be complementary investment, especially in transport infrastructure, alongside the electrification. And finally, the financial inclusion will also be crucial, not only to ensure that credit is going to productive farmers, but also to ensure that all of those that are currently excluded have access to the economy. To conclude, evidence from robust research serves as a basis for efficient, effective, and accountable policy making. It helps policymakers make informed choices that lead to better outcomes, greater public trust, and a more stable and prosperous society. The IGC, along with many other stakeholders at this conference, is proud to be able to contribute to this process. On behalf of the IGC, let me give special thanks again to the Ministry of Finance, not just for their dedication to the success of this conference, but for having the vision over the past 6 years to integrate the conference into the work of the ministry and into the work of government more broadly, to stimulate innovative thinking and actionable research, all with the aim of strengthening economic policy in Uganda. Thank you all for participating, for joining us to participate in this conference over the next day and a half, and I look forward to the many insightful ideas that we'll see. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, usually in the African culture, if you have a partner and a friend, a very dear friend to you, you give them a better and warmer hand clap. So can we give the IGC a better hand clap? And thank you, Jonathan, for your opening statement, Dr. Jonathan Lip. We want to transition to our very first session, but before that, allow me to recognize the presence of the Honorable Henry Musasizi, the Minister of State for General Duties in the Ministry of Finance, Planning and Economic Development. He will also have a session he'll be chairing immediately after the Honorable Lugolobi. But also, of course, with us is the Honorable Paul Omara, who is part of the... He's a politician, but he's also a former banker. So once a banker, you're always a banker, as a banking executive. And we want to recognize the role of Parliament in the conversation we're having today, the oversight role you play. I will now quickly transition to the session, but before I invite the session chair, I want to welcome our virtual audience and those watching online and on television that we are using the hashtag 7EG, I think it's 7EGFUG as our hashtag. Please share the conversation and let's spread the word. The conversation we're having this morning needs to be inclusive, and that's why we want as many people online, both here at home and abroad, to see what we are saying here and share the information that we are receiving this morning, the very rich information that we continue to receive this morning. I now invite the Honorable Amos Lugolobi to come and begin his session. He's looking at the global economic developments and implications for economic growth. As the session chair, he will invite his panelists, but first he will, of course, set the stage with an opening statement.
Thank you so much, Morris. To avoid unnecessary risks, I'll observe and stand on the protocol as already introduced in this meeting. This session discusses the global economic developments and implications for economic growth in Uganda. Ladies and gentlemen, distinguished participants and esteemed guests, let me begin by saying good morning. I expected a response. It is with great pleasure that I stand before you to inaugurate this consequential session on global economic developments and implications for economic growth in Uganda. So far, as has already been indicated, Uganda's economy is now on a recovery path from the effects of COVID-19. And this is despite other recent global shocks like the Russia-Ukraine war that is still ongoing. One of the major drivers of this recovery has been continued government support to the private sector through various programs like EMIOGA, I'm sure you have heard about that, Small Business Recovery Fund, available under Bank of Uganda, and the continued funding to Uganda Development Bank, as well as support to development of necessary infrastructure like roads, industrial parks, and electricity. The discussion today shall therefore focus on some of the most pressing challenges and opportunities that confront us as policymakers, as economists, and decision makers. We shall delve into the intricacies of navigating rising global interest rates and the need to manage rising debt servicing costs. We will also deliberate upon the strategies best fitted to safeguard our economy against potential external shocks that loom on the horizon, and how best policymakers can manage a pullback in capital flows. Lastly, we shall discuss the trade-off between Ugandan policymakers focusing on exchange rate stability and export competitiveness. Ladies and gentlemen, it's my privilege, therefore, to introduce our esteemed panelists who will illuminate us on the crucial matters, and I will mention one by one as they get to take their seats. Dr. Chris Adam, Dr. Chris Adam, may you please move, and I'm sure a round of applause will make him happier. Dr. Chris Adam is a professor at Oxford University in development economics and a fellow of the European Development Network. His presentation will focus on shocks and uncertainty in the global economy, adjusting to a world with reduced capital flows. The second one is Dr. Elizabeth Kasekende. May I invite you to take your seat? Would you please clap for her? Dr. Kasekende is an assistant director in charge of economics modeling and forecasting at the Bank of Uganda. She holds a PhD in economics from the University of Cape Town, South Africa, Master of Science in Economic Research, and a Bachelor of Arts in Economics from the University of North Texas, USA. She has published a number of topics including monetary policy, macroeconomic forecasting, financial inclusion, financial innovation, and natural resources. Our third presenter will be Dr. Albert Musisi. This is well known to you. I wonder where he is. Dr. Albert Musisi, may please take your seat. He's a distinguished economist, as you all know him, with expertise in macro and micro policy, as well as poverty analysis. Currently, he's a commissioner who oversees macroeconomic policy and collaboration in the Ministry of Finance, Planning, and Economic Development. As you know, macroeconomics gives us the strategic direction, so he's the man in charge. His presentation will take us through an exploration of Uganda's economic growth performance, pre- and post-COVID-19 challenges and opportunities. So following their insightful presentations, we'll be privileged also to hear from the discussants. We shall have Dr. John Mutenyo, a Makerere University senior lecturer in economics. Dr. Mutenyo, may you please also take your seat. May you please clap for him as he comes. Dr. Mutenyo is a senior lecturer of economics at the School of Economics, Makerere University. In 2018, he was a visiting scholar at the University of Nottingham in the UK. Between 2009 and August 2011, he was a researcher, a research fellow, postdoctoral fellow at the Brookings Institution, African Growth Initiative, Global Economy and Development, Washington, D.C. Prior to joining the Brookings, he was a visiting scholar at the International Monetary Fund in Washington, D.C. He holds a PhD from University of Dar es Salaam, Tanzania. John is currently the Vice President of the Uganda Economics Association and specializes in development macroeconomics and natural resource and environmental economics. We also have Isabella Kapozi, the IMF resident representative for Uganda. Yes, you are most welcome. And she's experienced in African and global economies. So that is a team that we have, and I'm sure it's a very competent team. And to set the ball rolling, I'll invite Dr. Albert Musisi to take us through Uganda's economic growth performance, pre- and post-COVID-19 challenges and opportunities, new growth opportunities. Dr. Musisi.
I think you have to change the slides to mine, please. Thank you, Honorable Minister. I think I'll follow your cue and say all protocol observed, as was highlighted. I want to start by welcoming all of you to the 7th Economic Growth Forum. Our theme this year is strengthening Uganda's competitiveness to faster accelerated growth. I don't know if... And to start off the discussion of the presentation, the objective of this forum is to review our economic growth performance pre- and post-COVID-19, identify the binding constraints to achieving faster, sustained economic growth, also recommend some strategies to accelerate economic recovery, sustain high inclusive growth, enhance productive employment creation, poverty reduction, and human development in the face of the frequent internal and external shocks. But also importantly is to provide evidence to inform our national budget priorities and growth strategy for the financial year 2024-25 and the medium term. Now, in terms of our performance, if you look at the last 30 years, our performance has been impressive, I would say. Average growth has been 6.6% for the period of 30 years. But even though this has been remarkable, given the several internal and external shocks, the recent decade, the last decade that we have just ended last year, we have seen a significant slowdown in growth, even though it's above the sub-Saharan average. If you look at the last 20 years, our average growth of the 20 years just before the recent decade, our average growth has been at least 7.5%. And per capita GDP growth has been at least 4%. And when we had this, that's when actually we are talking about actually joining middle income, as you know. But this recent decade has been not so good because of the many things we are going to talk about. Average growth declined to just 4.7%, which is just slightly above the sub-Saharan average of 3%. And per capita GDP slowed down significantly to about 1.5%. Now, this is actually one of the reasons why we did not achieve the target we thought we would achieve in NDP 2, right? Now, if you focus on just the GDP per capita in the last 30 years, growth in this, and you can see that the increase has been quite significant. It has more than tripled despite the high population growth rate. In 1993-94, our per capita GDP was $336. Last year, we had gone up to 1,088, and I was pleasantly surprised to see that when I checked in the NDP3, the target we had for that year was 1049, which means that what we achieved last year is about $39 above the target that we had set ourselves to achieve. I was a bit surprised actually to see this, but that's what the number is. And this is data from the Uganda Bureau of Statistics, not from myself. Eh? So, it is actually impressive if you look at that. But if you look at the last 10 years, as I said, it has been a period of economic shocks, but also resilience and gradual recovery. And the last 10 years, especially the first 4 years of that period, we had growth slowing down to about 3.1% in just a short period of time from the highs we had in 7%. And the major reasons that we have seen is that mainly the large effects of the global financial crisis, climate change, as we have been talking about that, droughts and other natural disasters. We had a serious drought in 2016-17. And as you can see, that's one of the years where we had a major drop in GDP growth. And that actually inspired, or at least drove us to think about this very forum, not coming out of the ideas actually to boost growth. In our first Economic Growth Forum, which we had in 2017, September 2017, that was the very first one, we had a number of ideas coming from a number of researchers, international and local, but also from everybody here. There were a number of ideas. And I remember we recommended a number of things, which I am going to go through now. One of them was increasing support to productivity-enhancing services, mainly support to research and development, drought-resistant seeds, agriculture extension, support for production of high-quality seedlings, particularly in coffee, investment in needed infrastructure by the private sector to reduce production costs, and that's where we put more emphasis on industrial parks, provision of affordable capital through UDB, EMIOGA, and now the Small Business Recovery Fund. And you know that at least in the budgets, there was a focus on these areas. And then we also talked about efficiency in public investment and improving public investment management, and then greater focus on regional integration, and the focus on implementation of of necessary actions in the oil and gas sector. Now, all these, that's my thinking, must have affected what happened next, where we had some increase in growth, right? However, we got another shock, and that was the COVID-19, and our growth dropped to 3% in 2019-20. Still positive and better than many countries, but a huge drop from where we were. It interrupted the very impressive recovery. And if you see, the next period has been another COVID-19 shock, the Russia-Ukraine war, but nevertheless, we continue to grow. So it was a period of resilience and steady economic recovery, as you can see. It is not the sharp increase that the minister talked about, but nevertheless, still a gradual improvement. So he was not so much off the mark, if it was not for COVID-19 and the conflicts that we have seen, not only in Russia and Ukraine, but also around the region, which have affected our growth performance. Okay, so what is our outlook now? As I've already said, our growth has been above the sub-Saharan average, but below what we achieved in the previous decades. Nevertheless, research on economic growth by both local and international researchers, for example, at Harvard, but also at the IGC, and even our own EPRC, point to the fact that Uganda actually is destined to grow at much faster growth rates. However, this outcome will depend on a number of things. The first one is whether Uganda finds solutions to several binding constraints to economic growth. The second one is whether we take advantage of the growth opportunities, particularly in high-valued agriculture, tourism, manufacturing, hydrocarbons, and natural gas. And then continuing with the export diversification, which has been already talked about. And I'm going to go a little bit deeper into that later on in my presentation. So if you look at Harvard's projections for the period, for this decade, from 2021 to 2030, they point to the fact that the growth poles or the growth centers in this decade are going to be in East Asia, and they point to 5 countries. In Asia, there are 4: China, Vietnam, Indonesia, and India. China is projected to grow at 5.82% on average for that period. Vietnam would be growing at about 5.64%, and India at 5.19%. The 5th country that they have grouped in the fastest growing is Uganda in East Africa, which they believe can grow at 7.5% in these 10 years, if some of the things I highlighted actually happen. But they also think that the East African region is going to be one of those countries that of the regions that are going to grow quite fast. The other countries in East Africa that they have in their research is Tanzania at 5.87%, and then Ethiopia, Kenya, and DRC is very low at 2.2%. But the other countries in East Africa, but you can see that they see huge potential in Uganda, and there are a number of reasons why they have that thinking. For the Ugandan case, they look at population and what we do to that population, and the success we have so far achieved in our diversification of the products that we produce, including the exports that we have managed to do in the last few years, including some light manufactured products. And then they see that we have a capacity to actually grow much faster. However, a number of binding constraints that we have to deal with to achieve this growth. The first one is what has already been touched on: internal and external shocks. Mainly the reason for this is globalization, the increase in the interlinkages between our economies, and the more frequent negative external shocks. We must find solutions to this. The second one is climate change, more frequent in Uganda now, and it's going to affect us. As you know, we have had droughts in 2009, 2011, and 2016. So it's almost becoming a new normal for us in terms of our climate. So we must define ways to deal with this. And you remember in our Economic Growth Forum 5, there are a number of proposals that were made to make sure that we limit the probability of at least the domestic shocks, but also to minimize the damage that we can face and also build resilience. Of course, I've already talked about export diversification, building buffers, and fiscal rules. Some of these we have already done. The fiscal rule we have put in place. And of course, we have built buffers with our reserves, although the fiscal side, we are yet to do much on this. And if we do some of this will minimize the impact of these shocks. But I think one which is really binding is low productivity. This is when we have the crisis, and even before we had the crisis, our productivity has really been low. And analysis of our sources of growth using the growth accounting approach shows that capital accumulation and labor have been the major contributors to our economic growth rather than increasing in productivity. Now, this is obvious because of where we actually have our people. Most of our people are in low productivity subsistence agriculture. We are also having many people in low productivity services. So this means that productivity continues to be a binding constraint. So to achieve faster and sustained economic growth, we will have to increase productivity. In sectors like coffee, they use the example they give that in Vietnam, one tree, they can produce 4 kilograms, for example. But in Uganda, we produce about less than 1 kilogram of coffee. That you can see that you can actually improve your production 4 times by just improving productivity in coffee. But this is true also for other sectors, in services and in industry. So there's much more potential if we just increase productivity, even if we do not go into any other sectors, but just in the current sectors, if we improve productivity, growth would be boosted. So the other binding constraint that has been identified is what actually we produce and export. If you look at the graph there, we have improved and increased our exports significantly, even during the crisis period. You can see that our exports have increased from about $344 million in 1992 now to $7.3 billion. This is a reasonable increase. However, most of our exports are coffee, fish, tobacco, gold, and flowers, which are really vulnerable to world market prices, climate change. Coffee, for example, is badly affected by drought. And this is one of the reasons why the researchers think that we have great potential. We have seen an increase in export diversification into light manufacturing, construction materials. I was in Tanzania, and I found some of the tiles from Uganda being actually used in Tanzania, which means that we have actually managed to export to Tanzania some of these manufactured exports. And the idea is that if we only expanded on this, and if we continue to diversify, this will be a major input into our future growth. And this is what these researchers are saying, that if we continue on this trend and expand, we should be able to grow at more than 7.5% in this decade. One of the other areas which we all know and we have tried to deal with is costly local and foreign finance. We know that our investors, first of all, access is a problem, but also the price that they pay. The interest rates are very high. Even when we compare ourselves to our neighbors, for example, in Kenya, even when you adjust for inflation, you find that interest rates here are still high. Now, this affects the ability of enterprises to grow and innovate. And I hope that our colleague from Bank of Uganda will say something about this in terms of what they are doing, to help on this binding constraint. The minister is telling me I have 5 minutes. I will try to conclude. On the public sector also, increasingly we are relying on market-based funding, that is commercial borrowing. And the pricing there is very high, the interests are high, and this is feeding into our high debt servicing costs and affecting our expenditure on critical development sectors like infrastructure, which is weakening our economic growth potential. Lastly, we have public sector efficiency and effectiveness. Public sector efficiency and effectiveness can be and is a constraint to faster economic growth through its impact on both public sector and private sector productivity. One of the examples that we all know now is the institutional weaknesses we have and the coordination between government ministries, agencies, and departments. This poor coordination can delay completion of public investments, and that is a major problem in Uganda. It also delays reforms that are required, interventions, And this leads to a decrease in productivity, not only in the public sector, but also in the private sector. And public sector is an important driver of our growth. To conclude, in this forum, we are going to address ourselves to these binding constraints that I've highlighted. In the first session, we are looking at the global economic development and the implications for economic growth in Uganda. And then in the next session, we shall look at domestic revenue mobilization, mobilizing finance for economic development, boosting exports and farm productivity, climate change and growth. And then on Friday, that's tomorrow, we shall look at productivity, which I think is one of the biggest binding constraints. And we have a very good presentation from the National Planning Authority. And then the transition from the transition to the monetary economy, from the subsistence to sustained growth. And here we are going to be focusing on the PDM and its potential to boost our growth. We shall also have a keynote address from Stefan Dekon, and I think somebody forgot the protocol. We are looking to have a very good presentation from Stefan, and it is going to be looking at mobilizing political action for second and third generation reforms, lessons from Africa. This is a binding constraint too, I think, including in Uganda, and I look forward to his presentation. Then we shall summarize the ideas from this forum, and we shall then use that for our budget preparations and for our medium-term growth strategy. I thank you very much.
Another round of applause for Dr. Musisi. In fact, you still had 2 more minutes, but thank you so much for doing justice to this discussion on economic growth performance pre- and post-COVID-19, the challenges and opportunities, new growth opportunities, which you have promised us will be discussed in the subsequent presentations. One of the key binding constraints that really excited me was the one on productivity. This country has been over-dependent on rain, but there's this saying today that crops actually don't need rain, they need water. And our mindset has always been that crops need rain. So we have to wait for rain in order to produce in agriculture. So the thinking now, today, as we meet the climate change challenges, that crops need water, and we have to make sure that we provide that water throughout the year. Hence the need to ensure that we irrigate our crops. The second one is that our soils have run out of nutrients, and the import of that is that fertilizer has become an imperative to raise productivity in agriculture. So thank you so much for that wonderful presentation. May I now invite Dr. Chris Adam to give us a presentation on the shocks and uncertainty in the global economy, adjusting to a world with reduced capital flows. May you join me in welcoming him.
Thank you very much for that welcome, and thank you, Albert, for kicking off the session so comprehensively. So comprehensively, in fact, that I want to be careful not to just repeat many of the things that you've said. So what I want to do in my 20 minutes or so is just to make 2 sets of observations. I want to start with some observations about the environment in the region, how we got here, what the prospects, what we mean by the prospects of adjustment in a world with diminished external finance might look like, and then from that draw out 2 or 3 key areas of focus, of policy focus. when I prepared my slides, I hadn't studied the program in great detail, but it gave me great comfort to realize that the 3 or 4 points that I felt were the most important that we should be focusing on are indeed the themes of the sessions later today and tomorrow. And I'll try and elaborate on that as I proceed. So let me start with this picture, which hopefully will appear on the screen in a second. Yes. This is an observation of early 2020, in fact, May 2020. This is from a paper I wrote with some colleagues at the time, trying to make sense of what the macroeconomic adjustment profile might look like for Uganda or indeed for countries of the region in response to what we knew at the time about the COVID pandemic that was beginning to rip around the world. And the key points that came from this are ones that have been emphasized both by Jonathan in his presentation and by Albert. The key question was how effectively we could navigate the recovery from a shock that was both a domestic shock, a lockdown in terms of economic activity, but one that was severely exacerbated by a global recession. And I don't want to spend any time on this picture, but one of the themes that you might see is that a lot of the discussion around the nature of the recovery, both for Uganda and more generally in low-income countries, was the role of external finance, and in particular the role of overseas development assistance, and how that interacted with domestic policy measures and domestic policy reform, and how this interaction would shape the recovery of individual countries, but also Uganda in this case, from the shock of COVID and the lockdown and the global recession that was associated with it. And one of the striking things which is briefly shown in the following slide is, in a sense, how successful the macroeconomic response was amongst many countries, both in the advanced economies, but in the emerging markets and developing countries as well, the short-run and immediate response to the shock of COVID. The grid shows the lower quadrant of a monetary and fiscal response to the shock. That along the horizontal axis we see fiscal adjustment, the extent to which governments were able to loosen the fiscal stance, provide fiscal support to firms, to households during COVID. And on the vertical axis, the monetary response, which was very complementary in terms of easing liquidity conditions, ensuring that there was an appropriate degree of forbearance on debt, providing other measures that essentially relaxed the monetary stance. This was, in a sense, a textbook response to the kind of shock that COVID represented. And in that sense, the early assessment of the recovery prospects from COVID were really quite positive. This is a paper that I did with the Bank of International Settlements at the end of 2021, so just coming up to 18 months since the onset of COVID. And our stance was reasonably optimistic. What we know, however, is that optimism was perhaps a little bit over-optimistic, in a sense, that there was a bounce back in 2021, and that certainly you can see that in Albert's figures for Uganda, but also more generally. But the global recession that followed the COVID pandemic has proven to be deeper, more protracted, and much harder to exit from than was originally anticipated. And in particular, despite weak global demand, the contraction on the supply side of the global economy, not least because of the circumstances in China, meant that the economy was exiting this shock faced with serious inflationary pressures that saw the cost of capital rise worldwide, risk aversion rise, and so the cost of capital, the cost of borrowing for debtor countries and rising very sharply during this critical recovery phase, a factor that has certainly slowed down and made recovery much more difficult. And this, as was mentioned by our moderator here, was exacerbated by Russia's invasion of the Ukraine and the consequent effects, at least in the short run, on energy prices, but on a more protracted basis on global prices for key food and fertilizer commodities. A lot of the discussion over the last couple of years has been around the prospects of increased mobilization of concessional finance. And one of the key features we've seen at a global level is that that has not really come through. This picture is looking at net ODA flows, net development assistance to low-income countries. And after the highs of the early 2000s, which was associated with debt relief initiatives in particular, there has been a steady decline in ODA receipts as a share of GDP, recipient GDP, that is. This is for sub-Saharan Africa. And a decline that has not recovered substantially. There was a small tick up in 2021 and 2022, but all indications suggest this is not likely to recover, certainly not to the levels that were anticipated in, for example, the high-level forum that the government of France promoted a year or so ago. So instead of this anticipated surge in external finance, we've actually seen the opposite. A slowdown in external financing generally and in certain areas in particular. Net FDI flows have fallen back. There was a short spike in 2021, but the levels projected for this year, next year, and beyond remain relatively dampened compared to the middle of the first decade and a half of the 21st century. And likewise, one of the big drivers of capital inflows to sub-Saharan Africa, in particular, credit from China, has tailed off very substantially, and the short to medium-term prospects of a sharp recovery are not bright. This is a picture of just this is measured in billions of dollars of net loan inflows from China to sub-Saharan Africa. This is a somewhat misleading picture because it's highly concentrated in a small number of countries. If Angola accounts for maybe a quarter of all capital inflows, and if you take the top four recipients, Angola, Ethiopia, Zambia, and Kenya, there's somewhere close to 50 to 60% of capital inflows. But the period in the mid, say 2010 through to 2015, where there was a sense that capital from China and FDI capital was going to be a substantial driver of investment financing across the region in general, is clearly at best on pause and possibly unlikely to recover over an extended period of time. And the final point I want to make, just in terms of the environment of external financing, comes from someone who many of you know quite well, Gregory Smith, who's been writing a lot of interesting work about the Eurobond market. Now, I know this is not directly relevant at the moment for Uganda, but it's an important indicator of the broader financing environment that countries are facing. This is a market that is distinctly unattractive at present. Since about 2020, other than some refinancing activities, there have been no significant new Eurobond issues amongst frontier economies in sub-Saharan Africa. But the contrary, and this graph is an indication, is that Eurobond debtor countries that issued bonds over the last 10 to 15 years, are facing a very substantial wall of repayment that is coming up in 2023, 24, 25. Very, very substantial volumes of repayment of what are essentially bullet loans, single repayment loans that were issued in the period from about 2010 through to 2020. This is going to hit the markets very substantially over the next couple of years. And it's not of course, it's not impossible that these can be refinanced, that the maturity of existing bonds, they can be rolled over and refinanced, but the price at which they can be financed is really eye-wateringly high. This is a picture that shows essentially the secondary market yields for African Eurobond issues at present, again from Gregory Smith. This is, I think, as at March 2023, so it's about 6 months or 5 months out of date. And if you look to the left of the figure, at the bottom, there's a little green arrow indicating the range for advanced economy yields, the cost of borrowing for advanced economies. But if you look at where many of the sovereign debtors are in the private capital market in sub-Saharan Africa, the cost of finance is extraordinarily high. It's prohibitively high. Rates of return to investment may be high, but probably not as high as justifying this kind of yield. So, putting these bits together, the cost of refinancing combined with the nature of debt markets and the decline in the flow of concessional pure grant financing leaves us with this picture, which is very familiar. This is a picture for sub-Saharan Africa as a whole, but it puts into visual form what Jonathan was saying earlier in his remarks and what Albert mentioned about Uganda, that although debt is not at a critical level, sovereign public debt is not at a critical level, it is a level that severely compromises fiscal space. The dark blue bars are the evolution of total debt. The very dark bars at the bottom are the domestic share of debt. Green are projections that come from the World Economic Outlook, and the red line, you probably can't see the scale, but I think that is an important indicator. This is the debt service, the external debt service obligations as a share of export proceeds. These are extremely high, 25 to 30% of all export proceeds accounted for or diverted towards the servicing of external debt. The picture for Uganda is a compromise of what we see here, somewhat lower on the debt stock, which is clearly a favourable outcome, but significantly higher in the debt service obligation. The liquidity pressure or the debt service pressure faced by the government of Uganda on its external debt is very, very significant. So let me proceed to what I think all this leads us to need to focus on: priorities, challenges, and implications for policy. And I'm going to take maybe 5 or 6 minutes on this and then conclude. One way in which I like to think about the kind of policy challenges in macroeconomics is a picture that looks something like this, or it will in a moment. Thank you. What I've projected here on the top part of this picture is aggregate investment, aggregate domestic investment as a share of GDP. Now, we had a discussion earlier about the importance of productivity of investment, and that is absolutely central to the link between investment and growth. But while aggregate investment is not sufficient to support sustained growth, it is clearly a necessary condition. We need both the investment and the productivity investment to combine to generate high levels of sustained growth. Now, aggregate investment in Uganda, these figures are for Uganda, is somewhere in excess of 20% or so, between 20 and 30% of GDP gross. Obviously, capital depreciates, and so the net investment rate is probably something closer to 18, 19, 20%. This is an improvement in historical terms, but it's still relatively low. If we look at the kind of economies that have grown at the rates that Albert referred to in his picture from the Harvard Growth Lab, countries that manage to sustain growth of 7%, which is doubling the economy in a decade, That's what 7% per annum means. Countries that were growing at that rate and doubling in a decade were generating aggregate investment rates much higher than this, closer to 30-35% of GDP. Very high growth, but more importantly, supported by very high domestic savings. And the other two features of this picture, which I want to then use to focus on my key policy priorities, are the small purple blocks at the top here, which is the extent to which domestic saving is being used to finance public deficits. It's the fiscal deficit. So when that purple block appears above the line, above the blue blocks, that is essentially crowding out. That is the crowding out of domestic investment, domestic private investment by the needs of the state. And the red solid line is the current account deficit. It's the amount of external financing that is contributing or combining with domestic saving to produce domestic investment. So if growth is going to be underpinned by high levels of aggregate investment with appropriate high levels of productivity, there are three elements here that require focus. The first is the mobilization of domestic savings. The domestic savings rate has improved a little bit over recent years, but is still around about 20-25%. That is households and corporate. The dissaving from the public sector, in other words, the fiscal deficit, remains large, and large for very often entirely legitimate and appropriate reasons. It clearly spiked during COVID, and that was a big part of the adjustment from that shock. But one of the big challenges is the extent to which that fiscal balance can be stabilized. And the third is the degree of external financing, the current account deficit. I've already talked about the extent to which the external financing, at least concessional external financing, is increasingly difficult to address. But if you keep that picture in mind, that it's about domestic saving, external finance, and fiscal adjustment, that kind of rather neatly summarizes what I want to say in my last 2 or 3 minutes on the key policy priorities. I want to just highlight these and then use that to point to elements in the rest of the Growth Forum today and tomorrow, where I think we'll enjoy the benefit of a deeper dive into some of these issues. Let me start with debt, fiscal adjustment, and revenue mobilization. And I want to make the two following observations. That if you look at the kind of adjustment programs that are either underway or being developed or being discussed with the IMF or with other external partners, and internally in terms of macroeconomic management in countries in the region, they typically anticipate very substantial fiscal adjustment over the next 3 to 5 years, adjustments in the overall fiscal balance. And I just want to put some context to that. So I was looking at the recent, external credit facility that Uganda is currently working through. There's the new program in Zambia, and the new program in Ghana. And if you look at the amount of fiscal adjustment that is required, the amount to which the overall fiscal balance is anticipated to improve over the next 4 to 5 years, you get numbers something like this, sort of 3 to 4, as high as 5% in the case of Ghana. These are very large numbers, and it's important to emphasize that these are very large numbers. They're a significantly larger degree they entail a significantly larger degree of fiscal adjustment than not only these countries, but associated countries in the region have achieved over the good years of the first 2 decades of the 2000s. That is an enormously demanding challenge, and I think it's important that when we think about fiscal policy, the extent of that challenge is well understood. And this comes back to the first key priority, which will be picked up in session 2 of conference, and that is revenue mobilization. Uganda, as others have said, is characterized by atypically low revenue mobilization. And that is, it's moving in the right direction. It has been moving in the right direction, as this picture shows, over the last 5-7 years. The question is, how much more effective revenue mobilization can be achieved over the next period of time? And I think tomorrow, the next session on revenue mobilization is going to be central to that. The second issue on trade investment, I want to just make reference to one point that comes from a nice paper produced by the UK Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office by Nick Lee and colleagues, which looks at the centrality of export growth and its association with domestic investment. Now, these are just scatter plots. There's no causal link here that says you need export growth to generate private investment. But the point is that the positive external balance of trade is a key generator of savings that finance investment. The plot on the other side with the green dots is for high-income countries. It emphasizes that that is less important when you've got access and competitive access to capital markets, global capital markets. When your access to capital markets is highly constrained, that raises the importance of domestically generated or trade-generated savings. The balance of trade remains central there. I want to make just one point on this, and then I will conclude with some observations on green finance. Regional trade is increasingly going to be central to the overall balance of trade and hence the investment performance. And in recent months, there's been a lot of discussion about the challenge of dollar shortages, about initiatives to develop improved local currency borrowing, and possibly even local currency trading. You may have heard this discussion that's going on at the moment about the BRICS currency as a way of thinking about delinking from dollar-denominated invoicing and trade financing. I think this is a new area, and I think this is an area that is potentially of very significant interest. I don't believe it's a kind of a silver bullet that relaxes the constraints of productivity, growth, and investment in terms of driving improved external positions. But I think there's an interesting body of work that's starting to emerge on the development of local currency payment systems, locally in the East African community, but more generally in association with the Africa Comprehensive Free Trade Arrangement. This is something I think we should be focusing on. And my final point, Chair, I want to focus just for a moment on the one source of financing that is arguably growing rather than diminishing, and that is the green finance and the potential for accessing green financial markets for both investment in adaptation, but also in the transition to net zero. There's an awful lot of rhetoric around green financing. There is much, much less action. The various assessments of need based on nationally determined contributions put the green financing gap at a very, very substantial level for the continent as a whole and for individual countries in particular. The big challenge is that the majority of green finance that is available at present is probably debt financing. There's a little bit of FDI, but it's predominantly official and it's predominantly debt financing. Some of it highly concessional. I'm thinking of the IMF's RST, for example. But this is going to present serious challenges in managing fiscal space and the liquidity pressure that any additional debt financing is likely to bring. And let me close with one final observation that was mentioned about managing climate volatility. The management of climate volatility is going to be first order in its importance and significance for government, for ministries of finance, and for central banks. And the coordination of fiscal and monetary policy on dealing with climate emergency is, I think, perhaps the most central area that central banks and ministries of finance need to focus their coordination activities on. I know that Elizabeth's going to talk about some of these issues, so I'm going to stop at that point and hopefully pick up some issues around climate financing and its management in the discussion. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Chris, for that wonderful expose on adjusting to a world with reduced capital flows. Thank you so much for those insights. Another round of applause for him. May I now invite Dr. Elizabeth Kasekende. We are running out of time, and I would request her to limit her presentation to 15 minutes on the new strategies for monetary policy and debt management. You're welcome.
Thank you, Honourable Minister. Well, I had prepared for 20, but let me try and reduce the time. So basically this topic, new strategies for monetary policy and debt management, it's an exciting topic, and at the same time, it is very pertinent given the uncertainties that are occurring today. So starting off, what is this presentation trying to answer? The first question is, can monetary policy contribute directly to the attainment of a high but sustainable rate of growth, and therefore indirectly enhancing debt dynamics? Or should monetary policy setting take into consideration fiscal policy? And is there a role for coordination? I'll delve into that shortly. And can monetary financing of fiscal deficits, this is usually a taboo, but we'll discuss that, be used without endangering its overriding objective of price stability? And then what is the optimal monetary policy objective? So quickly moving on, for those of you who may not really know or understand what monetary policy is, because I know we have a lot of people watching, they may not be economists. So basically, monetary policy involves the adjusting of money supply to get some sort of a goal, to achieve a goal in terms of inflation stability and output stability as well. And then this does not any changes in money supply does not have an impact on output in the long run. However, it affects the change in prices. But in the short run, because prices are sticky or do not adjust immediately, we tend to see an impact on actual production of goods and services. But what does empirical evidence show, and what does economic theory state? Well, the best contribution that monetary policy can make to sustainable growth is maintenance of price stability. Dr. Adam spoke briefly about coordination or cooperation. When you think of fiscal policy and monetary policy, these two need to work hand in hand to be able to achieve our goal. Now, looking at the prisoner's dilemma, to just give a snippet of what I mean. If monetary policy coordinates fully with fiscal policy, you note that we end up achieving low inflation, high output, and high employment. However, on the other hand, if fiscal policy and monetary policy do not cooperate, we end up having high inflation, low employment, and low output. So this basically emphasizes that it is indeed a good thing for fiscal policy and monetary policy to cooperate. And then, obviously, if one party decides to cooperate and the other one doesn't, you achieve one goal and you don't achieve the rest. So how should fiscal and monetary authorities coordinate their policies to stabilize the economy? I'll give an example. If, for example, fiscal policy has some new structural reforms that affect prices, and at the end of the day, monetary policy does not put this into account when they're doing their analysis, then we end up getting the wrong result. However, if monetary policy then considers the changes that are being done on the fiscal side, we're better off getting a much better result. And monetary policy will always respond in case there are any risks to price stability. And there should also be very clear responsibilities between monetary and fiscal actors. Now, given that I have very little time, let me try and skip over a few of these. But I won't skip this one. I think this slide is important. I'll give an example of the impact. Since we're going to discuss debt, I think it's important to understand this. If, for example, we had expansionary fiscal policy, if government decided to spend more in order, let's say, to boost growth, what would happen is we would have higher interest rates. And as a result of higher interest rates, we'd probably have capital inflows and we would have currency appreciation. That would generally be the short-run response. The long-run response, however, would be that there would be government debt buildup. And we all know government can either finance its debt through domestic borrowing, external borrowing, or taxes. But what can government do if they have government debt buildup? Well, on the one hand, there is central bank monetization of debt, which is the same as monetary financing. What this does is, if the government borrows from the central bank to finance their debt, this would be a permanent increase in the monetary base, and that would lead to currency depreciation, or perhaps government could then become more frugal and decrease government spending to control this. So the discussion here is, let me try and see. You note that over the last decade and a half or so, we've had the previous presenters discussing the crises that have happened, the global financial crisis, COVID-19, and more recently, the Ukraine war. Now, moving back to the COVID-19, we noted that governments were trying to enhance growth. And as a result, they reduced their interest rates and also used unconventional monetary policy. As much as they were able to enhance growth, there were issues like somewhat we experienced the liquidity trap where they had low interest rates close to zero. Others borrowed quite a bit. And remember, they borrowed at a time when interest rates were low. So now when we got to the Ukraine-Russia war, we noted that inflation went up. Now remember, these are governments that have borrowed at that time, but then rates went up. So managing public debt became a problem. And so the debate is, can central banks or should central banks now use unorthodox methods, okay? Considering the taboo that has been monetary financing, should central banks now be able to use that given the issues at hand? Well, there are two schools of thought. There is one that's in favor of relaxing this taboo and go ahead and use a fiscal stimulus financed by money creation. But the problem is this would have, they claim that this would have an effect on aggregate demand a bigger effect on aggregate demand than a debt-financed one. And also, this particular school of thought claims that if we use this, especially if the advantages of using it are more than the disadvantages. But there is a much bigger group of the opponents who believe that monetary financing is a signal of fiscal dominance. And we all know that it's important to conduct monetary policy when there is central bank credibility. So what this school of thought argues is that if the central bank goes ahead and tolerates it, the fiscal authorities could push them further to provide more support beyond what is appropriate. So those are the two different schools of thought, although this taboo has worked for quite a number of years for some countries. So I think I'm going to skip some of these in the interest of time and go to the monetary policy objective. Now, for Uganda, for those who may not know, in the 70s and the 80s, we had a period of very high inflation, and in the 90s, there were so many reforms that took place. We had liberalization of interest rates. We moved from fixed exchange rate regime to floating exchange rate regime. We started monetary aggregate targeting. And then we saw inflation come down. We saw growth pick up. And so it worked really well for us. But then the money demand became unstable with new financial innovations. And in July of 2011, we moved from monetary aggregate targeting to inflation targeting. And this is a forward-looking policy. And so basically, this helps us address the potential threats of price stability. And we target core inflation of 5%. And I would like to say that ever since then, if you note from that graph, when we were the period during reserve money program, you note that there were spikes really above the 5%. It was difficult to target monetary aggregates. And at the time we took on inflation targeting, actually, inflation was quite high, but the central bank has so far managed to bring inflation to below 5%, and in the medium term, it's expected to be at remain around 5%. So inflation targeting, I believe, has worked quite well for Uganda in achieving the goal of price stability, but at the same time, supporting economic growth. So, now, looking at the monetary policy transmission mechanism, I think what's important is to note that when the central bank changes the rate, all other interest rates, it's a signal for all other interest rates, but it takes a lag to have an impact on the economy. And then there is a debate that is this the time now for monetary policy to adopt other long-run targets, such as growth the growth rate of economic activity, and perhaps for Uganda it is not feasible at this time. There is also another debate that that perhaps Uganda should fix or try to stabilize the exchange rate. Now, in economics, we have what we call the impossible trinity. It becomes a trilemma, okay? Because you're an independent central bank. At the same time, you have free capital mobility, and then a fixed exchange rate. You can't do the three. You have to pick whether you are an independent central bank, you have free capital mobility, of which Uganda, that's where we are. So if for example, Uganda tried to, this is just a hypothetical example, if we reduced the central bank rate, okay, and then we would see capital outflows. As a result, the exchange rate would depreciate. Now, if that happens, and then you're trying to fix the exchange rate, you're kind of undoing that which you wanted to do in the first place. So I think it's important to note that this is really key, that we can't do all the three, kind of like that gentleman there with the three bowls. I mean, he's trying to lift the three of them, but it's impossible. So usually when you ask the central bank, why is the exchange rate depreciating? Why don't you fix it? You have to remember that we have an independent monetary policy and free capital mobility. So we have to pick and choose what we want. We can't do all the three. There are some challenges still. And the first challenge, I think, which was already touched on, is the sticky lending rates. We've seen situations where the central bank reduces the central bank rate, but the pass-through to lending rates tends to take a much longer time, or lending rates don't come down as fast as they should. So the debate has been, is this the time now to cap interest rates? And the answer is not as easy. Right now, capping interest rates is not going to solve the issue of high lending rates. What you see from that diagram is the real issue as to why we have high lending rates is a structure issue. So let us sort out the structure issues. Already government borrowing, but we know that government, in terms of government consolidation, they're reducing domestic borrowing. So the real issue, and actually from all the studies that have been done, is overhead costs is the main driver for high lending rates. So can we sort out the structure issues? Can we sort out the cost of doing business? It's quite high. We need to look at, in terms of risk, if banks are not aware of someone's risk in terms of risk premium, but what has the bank done? We have now the credit reference bureaus in place. At least banks now can be able to see someone's credit worthiness. Perhaps that could reduce some of the things. But the cost of doing business, I think that is key right there. If we can touch on the structure issues, we'll be able to sort that issue. But I think the solution is not capping interest rates for now. Now, the other issue that is a structure issue that also impacts on monetary policy, and which brings me back to the whole coordination of fiscal policy and monetary policy, is that sometimes inflation is supply side driven. For example, we've heard about climate change. There's only so much the central bank can do in terms of controlling inflation from the supply side. And that's where now fiscal comes in. If we have floods or poor weather, the central bank that may not directly be able to control inflation in that sense, because it's mainly demand side driven. Meaning if there's an increase in aggregate demand, then there we come in and raise interest rates. But this is where now the coordination comes into place, where we coordinate with the Ministry of Finance. Now, to quickly conclude, I've skipped quite a lot to try and keep within the time. Yes, to quickly conclude, BOU has really been successful in achieving price stability. And I think inflation targeting has done a great job at keeping inflation low and also supporting economic growth. But there's still a debate as to whether, given the uncertainties in place and given that there are borrowing constraints, is this the time to move to monetary financing? That is still a debate. And again, as I mentioned earlier, that if government tolerates it, they could face political pressures from the fiscal authorities to go beyond what they would have given to ensure macroeconomic stability. But there's still room for debate. I mean, especially the school of thought that thinks that this could be done. But there are issues, and the biggest issue is hyperinflation, and it could have devastating implications for the economy if taken on, especially if taken on when inflation is high and when we don't have a sustainable fiscal position. So I'm going to quickly skip through this. And so if it's taken on, this monetary financing, it should be limited. And this is really in extreme circumstances. In extreme circumstances where the central bank still keeps its independence. And again, I have to emphasize, in cases where there is sustainable fiscal position and low inflation. However, if a country has inflationary pressures, okay, and unsustainable fiscal positions and a weak central bank independence, it's probably best to stay away from this monetary financing because, again, it will cause devastating results. But then what do we do if a country doesn't have much room to borrow, be it domestically or externally, and at the same time there are repercussions for this particular nation to borrow from the central bank? What can we do? So I think governments could sit down and prioritize the expenditure, perhaps trim the expenditure, and focus probably on projects that are going to enhance growth. Rather than taking on the monetary financing and having dire consequences. Thank you so much. That's all I had for you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Elizabeth Kasekende, for taking us through that segment, which was, I'm sure, very interesting. We've seen how important monetary policy is and the interplay between monetary policy and fiscal policy. But a key question I'll leave to you is whether we don't have circumstances where, as a matter of policy, we could have inflationary spending to deal with an urgent or critical crisis in the economy and how that would affect the entire macroeconomics. Now, we are now going to a stage where we invite the discussants to discuss the presentations that have been made. And as I invite Dr. John Mutenyo to take the floor, I'm hit by a crisis somewhere which I have to go and address. But in the meantime, I'm inviting one of the panelists, Dr. Musisi, to continue presiding over this conversation. There's going to be a Q&A session immediately after the discussants have made their presentation. Please allow me to go for a few minutes to attend to another crisis, and Dr. Musisi will stand in for me. Dr. Mutenyo, do you like to take the floor?
Thank you very much, Honorable Minister. Protocol observed. I've been given 5 minutes to discuss 3 key papers. First, Chris Musso came to Uganda. I met Chris, first time I met Chris was in Accra, 1999. I met him several more times in Nairobi, South Africa, and Oxford. I'm happy you're one of my mentors in research. You together with Paul Collier and others. I want to thank very much the presenters for the wonderful papers. And I'm just going to go through them very fast because I have only 5 minutes. I'm going to use LIFO approach, last in, first out. LIFO approach. The paper by Elizabeth and Mugume emphasize a number of things. Talking about monetary fiscal policy coordination, and they are using what you call a game theoretical approach by employing what you call the prisoner's dilemma. And their fear is the Nash equilibrium, which has high inflation, low employment, and low output. And I think just like there is that fear, I think the best option is to seek for a cartel arrangement where you have cooperation, and then you have a low inflation, high employment, and high output. So this is basically an issue between the two institutions, like the central bank and the fiscal authority. They talk about the dangers of fiscal expansion. I'll talk about this later on. And then also talk about monetary financing to stimulate aggregate demand. True, Friedman recommends what you call the K% rule, which is between 2 to 3% annual rate. The problem, however, is that the measure of money is that the type or measure of money stock that the central bank can control, such as high-powered money, is not really closely linked with aggregate demand. Instead, it is M2, for which the central bank might have no control. The second problem, which again they also address, is that the central government, or what they are calling the fiscal authority, they are very careful when they are using selecting these words. The central government, what they call the fiscal authority, might overdo it, might ask for more and more financing. Now, they further caution higher monetary expansion, and which may lead to inflation, and of course it has adverse effects on the longer-term economic growth. And we know that the central bank has only one tool, that's monetary policy, which cannot actually help in raising GDP growth rates. The advice is that to achieve high economic growth, they should look elsewhere, talking about infrastructure gaps, address climate change, high population, cost of doing business. These are key issues we have in the country, cost of doing business. And of course the risks involved, which are actually leading to high lending rates. Now, their other issue is the issue of central bank independence. I'll talk much about this, together with the fiscal expansion. Now, you see, working for government, you have to be very careful with the words you use. And when they come to this, they talk about issues, they talk about fiscal authorities, but actually they are meaning the central government. Okay? Now, their worry is the central bank needs to be independent, which is perfectly right. But given what is happening currently, with lots of deficits, foreign currencies not moving in as expected, of course, you know what happened recently. The question is, will the central bank continue being independent and use its powers? Of course, here, the fear is, with all the decline in foreign exchange and large budget deficit, which of course will lead to a decline in investor confidence in purchasing bonds, local bonds, the central government is likely to ask for increase in tax revenue, what you call inflation tax revenue, or call it seigniorage. Or simply say, central bank might ask, rather the central government might ask the central bank to print more and more money. And this is very disastrous to the economy. Now, I want to assure the central bank that what happened recently when His Excellency the President signed a bill. President Museveni is a very wise man. He signed a bill, first of all, to please the politicians, the opposition, because the bill was brought by the opposition. So now the opposition is very happy. The president signed the bill. The religious leaders are very happy. He signed the bill. So politically, he gets a tick. Now the next thing is, second tick is looking for is economics. What he's going to do, in my view, because this is a person who hates inflation, he's going to look for now alternatives. What should we do? And he knows that his government has been overburdening all the taxpayers. There is a lot of fiscal indiscipline. He's going to work on that. You won't be surprised if there is a reduction in cabinet. You won't be surprised if the parliament is reduced. Mr. Musi called this public efficiency, but actually I wanted to say public inefficiency. There's a lot of inefficiency taking place. There's a lot of duplication of what? Of offices. Kampala has 10 RDCs and 2 cabinet ministers. I think this is the only country which has what? A city which is also a ministry. We have very many regional ministries. Karamoja is a minister, there is a ministry. All these, in my view, are going to be what? So he has to score another tick on the economic side by reducing all these duplications. Okay? Duplications. Now, I'm moving very fast. I now go to Chris Adams' paper. He mentions very many things here. He shows us how the prolonged global recession has taken place, stagnation in ODA, okay, and then decline FDI, decline in China. This is where you guys have been talking about, no, we can leave the World Bank, let's go to other alternative routes. China, for instance. You have to be very careful here. We can see that China loans to Sub-Saharan Africa are declining. And you must know that China loans are not like World Bank loans. Okay? Their loans are more like grants. They give you a loan, they follow it up. The multiplier process takes place back in what? In China. It doesn't take place here. So we have to be very careful. And above all, they are very expensive loans. So is that really the alternative route? No. The alternative is simple, to use the painful but sustainable way, which is reducing unnecessary government expenditure. Then there's rising domestic debt. This is very dangerous to our growth because it actually crowds out the private spending, which in turn reduces GDP growth. Further, then it talks about debt management as a solution, fiscal adjustment, which also Mugume talks about, revenue mobilization. This is wonderful, but the issue is to raise more revenue, there must be higher increase, not in government, in economic growth. Then improving external balance. He talks about trade. Now, indeed, we can only improve the trade balance if we trade more. Now the question is, trade with who? The recent past, you can see that if you look at the trend of Uganda's exports, we have been exporting more to our interregional, East Africa, COMESA, much more than the EU. And that is also his emphasis. We should continue trading more with the locals. And then also, what exports should we focus on? Okay? Traditional or value addition. Indeed, we need to move away from the traditional and then talk about the value addition. The question, however, is the people who are buying these goods which have value addition, are they willing to remove the non-tariff barriers? Okay? To remove non-tariff barriers. If I'm adding value to coffee today, will people purchasing coffee accept it in that new form? You know, okay, that's the major issue now. Now, what my view is, what we can do is to encourage resource-seeking FDI. Let's bring those companies that process coffee in Europe, they come and process coffee here, and then they export. That's the only way they can accept your coffee with the value addition. But if you decide to add value, you locally here, trust me, we are going to face a lot of what? Both the tariff and non-tariff barriers. And then the PSST also talks about which sectors should we focus on. The PSST has an answer to this question because some years back we wrote a paper with him when he was still the ordinary Ramadhan Gobi. And that paper answers all his questions. And I was very happy when he went on that office. I said, I think this is the time he's going to partner with NPA and address this paper. The sectors we talked about are quite a number of them, but briefly, these are sectors where with higher multiplier effects. Sectors which will benefit other sectors, creating both direct and indirect what? Jobs. He has an answer to that. The paper is there, okay? And then finally, issues of climate change by Chris, these are very important because they actually affect the supply side. So government must address these issues. Then Chris also talks about tapping on green financing. It may not be very possible for developing countries, like he acknowledges. But instead, in my view, and also this is, we don't provide short-term benefits. These are long-term benefits, okay? Now what we need, we as Uganda, is access to foreign market without barriers. Access, this is sustainable. We shall produce our goods, add value, and export them. Okay, other than waiting for green financing. That one can come later. Then finally, Albert talks about 70% growth as per Harvard Lab. Yes, we can achieve this. But one thing we must do is to remove all the barriers. Issues concerning infrastructure issues, which also Elizabeth raised. You saw the other track, which was whatever. Infrastructure issues. Issues concerning climate change, reduce domestic borrowing. You know what's happening in Uganda with domestic borrowing. This crowds out private investment. So you have to reduce all these issues, okay? And then finally, which I think I've already mentioned, you talk about public sector efficiency. I think he was very wise being a government employee. He wanted to talk about public sector inefficiency. So these are things that must be addressed. Public sector inefficiency, duplicating resources, duplicating offices. We have a lot of these offices which are actually redundant in this country. And accordingly, the productivity is very low in Uganda. These are issues that we must address. Okay? I'm caught up with time. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much. I think you should join us in the Ministry of Finance. So you will find that probably you have start speaking differently also. But want to welcome the IMF Res Rep, Isa. I call her Isa because that's what I know. And IMF is known for strict conditionality. The conditionality here is only 5 minutes.
Be shorter than that, and I really hope that I'll earn an invitation to work for the Ministry of Finance after this as well. So thank you very much for the opportunity to close the opening chapter of this 7th High-Level Economic Growth Forum. 7 is a lucky number in my culture, and I really feel lucky for being here. So the 3 presentations we have seen provide a chapeau for the discussions we will witness this afternoon and through tomorrow. So it's really not fair that I vivisection them. But I do have some comments. First, I really like very much how we are looking at the main theme in this conference, the growth, through the right denominator, and this is the population. Per capita growth is the only growth that matters. It's the only one that is shared and in which we can be sure that every year the entire population is a little bit better off than in the previous year. And what we have seen from the presentations that in the sub-Saharan Africa region over the last decade, we have not seen GDP per capita growth. Hence, this topic is even more important today. So, what we have seen in the composition of growth, that productivity, low productivity, is the real culprit of this slowdown, including in Uganda, where we have seen a little bit stronger per capita growth than the average. And there are several reasons for them that have been quoted, such as the cost of credit, public sector efficiency, and others. What I really miss from this discussion, though, is the role of education and skilling in contributed to the per capita GDP growth, to productivity. But I'm very reassured by the following presentations that I've been able to pick through, and there will be some discussion on the role of education as well in productivity. The presentation by Beck of Uganda, I must say, is the most thought-provoking for me. And actually, I'm a little bit worried when I hear there have been some slides that you have not seen. But the presentation starts off by talking about monetary and fiscal policy coordination, and it's a little bit monetary-centric, in as much as it says that there is coordination if the monetary policy is left to do whatever it's meant to do. But then as the presentation moves on, you really see that these interactions are very, very complex. So the presentation introduces a very interesting argument in favor of monetary financing of the deficit. When is it warranted? When is it, how? It doesn't really, the assumptions behind it is that the monetary financing of the deficit can contribute to growth, but only short term, not long term. Or at least the presentation does not discuss how can fiscal financing of the deficit contribute to long-term growth. What got me a little bit worried that it seems that the preconditions for using this tool in Uganda are already there. The fiscal position is perceived as sustainable. Therefore, there would be no perceived pressure from the fiscal authorities to finance the deficit. The central bank is credible. Inflation is declining. And the lending rates are high not because of fiscal dominance, but because of structural rigidity, as Dr. Musisi has told us. So there is allegedly space for this temporary and careful experiment, but really careful with it, I would say. And as you, Elizabeth, have said as well, central bank independence is a very fragile concept. It's impossible to measure. Even fiscal dominance is very difficult to measure. Fiscal sustainability we do measure, but it's subject to all the variables that you have no control of over a very long period. Communication, how to explain the public that the monetary financing is happening without pressure from the fiscal authorities, that's something I would not even know how to venture into. So just to look back into this discussion on productivity, that is central to this forum. Low productivity is typically associated with high inflation. What we observe in Uganda is not high inflation, aside from some short periods of instability due to outside pressure, external shocks. So my question is, how is this possible? Does the monetary policy have to overcompensate for the low productivity in order to keep inflation in the target? And if yes, what does this do to fiscal sustainability and to future growth? In other way, what are the costs of low productivity? This is an open question. I hope we will be able to hear some answers to it, and if not, there will always be an 8th high-level growth forum to pick up from there. Thank you very much.
Maurice said we have very few minutes, so we shall be getting some questions from the audience, maybe only 4, and then we shall have to break for tea. And I will probably just pick one person from each end, and then that will be it. Yes, Honorable.
Okay. Thank you very much. My name is Victoria Sektoreko from Private Sector Foundation of Uganda. And I will go directly to the PSST because he knows whenever I'm seated here, I listen intently. We really appreciate that you did not come up with new taxes, but really that's not our worry. Those are not the ones killing us. It is the present tax system which is killing us, specifically for agribusiness. How did you choose to come up with that 20% presumptive tax on all our businesses? And how did you select who to charge it on and who not to charge it on? Because it is selective and it is really punitive. Secondly, Mr. PSST, you said your job is to listen to the private sector and make sure that we can do our business. Could you please listen to us, as you have said, and then respond where it hurts most? For example, what do we want now? Please talk to URA and UNBS. Through the killing of the QMAC by UNBS, all the small manufacturers are now out of business. Can you please listen to us and do something about it before we bury them? Thirdly, I find it very interesting when we all sit here and pretend we don't see what is obvious everywhere. If you were to be asked, where are all the youths now? Most of them are in innovations and creative sector. But it is never mentioned. Is there any reason why nobody ever talks about the music in this country? If you are looking for taxes, it is musicians who can collect a lot of tax in just one day. But somehow when we come to these high-level meetings, we pretend they are not there, we don't mention them, we don't plan for them. For example, they have to beg to work. For those of you who may be like me who enjoy music, recently when there was this new singer, Ellen Skin, at Freedom City, people were fighting to pay, and every ticket brings taxes. But nobody has ever thought of planning for those youths where they can perform. Apparently, when you go to Lugogo cricket ground, that one can only be used twice or thrice a year. Then Kololo, people are sleeping. Then really, these are real children. This is our culture. They bring in tourists. They bring in money. Why are we looking? I'm sure you are surprised why today I'm not talking about agriculture. You know, if you can look at that picture in the right-hand corner at the bottom, you see a banana plantation. This singer who sang about the banana plantation of Lusukura Cement made money in 2 months, which the owner of the Lusuku will never make even if he owns the land. So can we look at creatives? I thank you.
Thank you. Honorable Omara.
Thank you very much, the presenters and then the discussions. I think we've learned a lot of things today. We have noted very clearly from the statistics that Uganda's economy is easily susceptible to external shocks. We have seen that in the global financial crisis and COVID-19. And so therefore, if anything teaches us is one thing, is that we have to grow our economy based on manufacturing and exports of value addition products, not raw materials. I would want to direct these questions to our friends in the Ministry of Finance. I have been severally to the major industrial parks. What you see there is basically an extension of, how do I call it, assembling plants of Chinese products, again in the country. When are we going to use domestic materials, value addition based on our competitive advantage in Uganda here, so that we can export more products from Uganda, other than again bringing and assembling some of these materials from here? The second one is that the recent events shows that in the mid to long term, we must seriously reduce our reliance on external debt financing, because as we have already seen, it has got terrible impact on our fiscal space. In effect, we are debt trapped. What is it that we are going to do differently to look for alternative sources of financing, and most importantly, creating deficiencies in public administration, reducing size of our government, and also reprioritizing some of the projects in the country and being more frugal? Thank you very much. What is it that we are going to do, especially again from government side?
Honorable.
Thank you. I am Nakut Faith, the woman MP for Napak. The presentations we've had have highlighted two key options. One is to resort to monetary policy. The other is to resort to reducing government expenditure. I will speak on reducing government expenditure. That will be, if that option is taken, then the citizens will be very happy. Politically, it will be good for all of us who are in politics. However, given that government is actually one of the biggest consumers of goods and services in Uganda, will reducing government expenditure yield growth? Where will the alternative market be for the goods and services the Ugandans will be producing?
Go ahead.
Thank you. I'm Cordwell Gawa William from the private sector, Chuma Technologies and Innovation Center. I want to thank the organizers of this workshop, Minister of Finance, but now run quickly to my two questions because we are running out of time. To Kaseke, I want to know which boards are we holding, because we are in this impossible trinity. Which boards is Uganda holding? Then two, I want to add my voice to the IMF discussant. I'm also puzzled and I'm disturbed by the low productivity in Uganda. We had an SDG festival, Sustainable Development Goals Festival, sponsored by the UN and other partners. Many Ugandans exhibited what they are doing. But we're also wondering, why do we still struggle with productivity? So, Ministry of Finance and, of course, Bank of Uganda to tell us what is the problem, where is the problem, why is Uganda still producing low? If we are producing, why are we not recognized? And this also, of course, adds a voice to what Sechtoreko said. Taxation, people are producing and we are not taxing. In one of the forums, I brought an example of taxis. There's a lot of money taxi people are collecting from us. I paid money to a taxi. How much is government taking from that? I would want to know. And if you are not taking it, then you are losing a lot of money. because it ends up in just individuals and you are not tapping it. Of course, this at one forum of SDG conference which we had, a discussant proposed digitizing receipting. Is it digitized receipting? Are we taking it on as Uganda? Is it something we are focusing? So that maybe that way we'll be able to get every little tax so that we grow our tax base. I thank you.
Okay, the head of the private sector out there. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Dr. Msik. My name is Grace Nshamere. I'm from Private Sector Foundation, Uganda. I want to express a difference in opinion from Dr. Mutenyo regarding green financing. I think he said that it can wait. It shouldn't wait. Our neighbors, Kenya, Rwanda, are tapping into this financing, and we're behind the curve. We know that our neighbors are net importers of food. We know that 30% of our land is actually water. So the issues to do with climate change, weather-dependent agriculture, can easily be addressed by solar irrigation. The sun is really burning us. We're not converting it into energy that can power our farms. Can we consider solar irrigation at scale, leveraging Lake Victoria, the biggest lake in Africa, River Nile, Lake Chog? I can go on and on. We have a lot of water. We just need to stretch it to the rest of the country. Thank you.
Thank you. Nixon Kitimori. I was wondering, we've heard about fiscal consolidation measures and other austerity measures currently being taken or going to be taken by the government. And I was wondering whether debt restructuring has also been considered as an option, because historically, emerging economies and other developing economies have used debt restructuring to help alleviate their debt ratio concerns. Implementation using, of course, reduction in the face value of debt, which reduces the debt stock almost immediately, or through cash flow relief with no face value reduction, which reduces the present value of the debt through changes in the scheduled payments. Thank you.
Okay, unless maybe we take one person from there and then we stop. Julius.
Thank you so much. The presenters, thank you so much for your presentation. I want to talk to Dr. Mutenyo. You made actually very good prophecies on what General Museveni will do next. But I want you to change and instead of making them prophecies, make them probably technical recommendations, because these are the things that need to be done in order to improve. Then the other thing you talked about was about international trade, probably opening up markets, removing trade barriers. LDCs have actually signed quite a lot of agreements with WTO, and some of these agreements, I don't know whether we sign them without looking into the details of these agreements. For example, there are clauses in WTO agreements that that allows LDCs to probably export about 80% of manufactured goods and only 20% of raw materials, raw goods or non-manufactured goods. If you look at everything else but arms and other agreements that are signed by LDCs. So we really need to move forward and work on some of these technical barriers and non-tariff barriers for us to improve in our trade. Thank you so much.
Lastly, Julius.
Yes, quickly. I just want to take it from, I think, from the PSST. I think for the first time, he has not told us or lectured on what he's going to do, the things he has done, but I think he has really challenged us in terms of, how should we grow? Where should we put money to accelerate this growth? Which priorities should we set up? I think these are, serious questions that we need to answer. And I will attempt one, but also I will ask colleagues on the panel to answer them. My understanding right now is that our biggest challenge is not financing in this country. The biggest challenge is execution of utilization of the little resources that we have to be able to to bring returns. And as such, probably a panel could delve into how should we execute or utilize the little resources. I think for me, Albert, is something that we need to look at. If we are going to put all the money in the infrastructure, which roads start first? Should we do all the roads at the same time? Which road should start first? Which transmission line should first start, and where should it go? Should we ensure that each and every village has a primary school, or that each and every household has, power connected to it, even those that are grass-thatched? I think it is important that probably the panel could look into that and give some advice. I will be very grateful. I thank you.
Number of questions for the PSST, and representing him is the Director Economic Affairs. I think he will answer some of the issues. I want to start with him. From Honorable Secretary Leko, on taxes. Why are you imposing such high presumptive taxes? And a number of others, which I think you took note of. Please.
Yeah. Thank you very much. Good afternoon to you all. Is it afternoon? Okay. Yeah, a number of very important and provoking questions have been raised by Honorable Secretary Leko. And yes, we do have presumptive taxes, and these are meant for people who may not be able to keep a proper books of accounts, but they're in business. So there is a presumptive tax that they pay. And we've been trying to reform this tax over a number of years. And what we have now is a 4-band structure. It's not a 20%. It's a 4-band structure where there is 1% tax on a gross turnover, business with a gross turnover of between 10 and 30 million. When you have a business of less than 10 million, you don't pay anything. Then there is so there are 4 bands for all the people who have small businesses. But we are open for further discussions on this matter. If this is stifling and crippling some businesses, we are open to reform, because that's why we are there. We listen to you. On the youth, especially the ones in the creative industry, you are right. And it is one of the areas we are actually trying to grapple with and try to see how we can assist. One, these youth have financing under the EMIOGA. It's one of the EMOGAs there. They have been getting financing, and they have claimed that this financing is not enough. So in our discussions with in the EMIOGA, we are trying to see how we can provide more funding for these creative artists to be able to further their professions. So it's really something that we are discussing and trying to take care of. On industrial parks by Honorable Omara, that there's only assembly in the industrial parks. Yes, there's a lot of assembly, but there's also a lot of manufacturing that is beyond assembly. Some of them are using intermediate products, others are using raw materials. And we are seeing, for example, people who are making tiles. That is not assembling. They're actually making from that, and they're making other ceramic materials from that. So we are seeing that. But also, assembling is a very good way of starting manufacturing, because a lot of people are not manufacturing. And we are putting in place measures really that are driving towards enhanced manufacturing. You may have heard some people in the steel sector crying foul that we have increased taxes on wire rods which are making nails and other steel products. But because we are seeing capacity developing here, then we impose taxes on those things to discourage that. I think the rest of the questions will be answered by the presenters. Thank you so much for listening to me.
So we are going to give 1 minute to each of the presenters, because most of the issues actually we are going to go into in depth in the next sessions. So 1 minute for Dr. Chris Adam. From there.
Thank you. I think for Bank of Uganda, we just had one question. Almost all the questions were to the Ministry of Finance. And the one question that I got was on the impossible trinity. Now, the impossible trinity, what did I mean with the impossible trinity? I meant an independent central bank. At the same time, you have free capital mobility, and you also have a fixed exchange rate regime. Now, you can't do the three, so you choose two. So for the case of Uganda, we have an independent monetary policy and free capital mobility. So maybe let me give an example again. If, for example, the central bank was to reduce the central bank rate, what that would do is it would mean that the rates abroad, the interest rates abroad, would be more lucrative for investors than the rates in Uganda. And that would lead to capital outflows, and therefore the exchange rate would depreciate. But because we do not have a fixed exchange rate regime, we have a floating exchange rate regime. So if you were to now try to fix it, you're trying to reverse what you were intending to do. So I think that's a clarification on the impossible trinity. Thank you.
Thank you very much. There were also some questions for Dr. Mutenyo.
Thank you very much. Very first, about 3 questions, I think.
Yeah, but just choose maybe 1 or 2 because of time. 1 minute.
Maybe I'll go for one which is about to turning my profession to recommendations. Well, I think I was being polite. Okay. See, in some cases, you have to be polite. Now, if I have to turn this into recommendations, then they are as follows. There is need to reduce what you call fiscal, government expenditure. For instance, do we need that cabinet of over 80 ministers in this small, poor country? Do we need over 140 districts where each district basically relies on the central government for funding? So simple. If a district cannot raise over 60 to 70% of its revenue, it should be merged with another district. Do we need over 500 members of parliament? Okay? Compare with other developed countries like the US, with only 100 members who are voting. Okay? Then, do you need ministries like, say, Kampala, Karamoja, Luwero? I don't know, for over 20 years it has been Minister of Luwero. What development, what have they done? Is there a new hospital in Luwero? Is there a new road in Luwero, for instance? So these are issues that should be addressed by. So do we need all these duplications? At university, you have what you call the Vice Chancellor, the Deputy Vice Chancellor for Academic Affairs. Then there is the University Secretary, there's University Bursar. All these are doing almost the same thing. You have Academic Affairs, you have the Registrar. If you have about 20 universities, public universities, so if you multiply that, and now remove all those Land Cruisers and Prados, which these guys are enjoying, how much are you saving? Okay? These are issues we should talk about. You have 10 RDCs in Kampala, and then 2 ministers, then plus the mayor, plus, you understand? These are issues which we need to address. I already not talk about issues of mainstreaming, but also how should we spend money? On which sectors should we spend government resources? Talk about those sectors that will create what you call aggregate demand. Those are sectors that should be emphasized. Spend money on sectors that will create employment, sectors that will create what? Increase aggregate demand. That's why you should spend the money mostly. Okay? So these are issues we're talking about. But I think I was being a bit polite. But that's how we should go. Maybe that enough? Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Isa, please, 1 minute.
Thank you, Albert, for my minute. I'm going to use it also, although I could not identify a question for the IMF. Just a reaction to what I hear today is I'm quite disheartened to hear from some of you that you see the fiscal consolidation process as an exercise in expenditure cutting. This is not what it is. This is not what we are implementing in Uganda under the program that is financed by the IMF. We are looking into revenue mobilization for fiscal consolidation. And this is important because we're all talking here about productivity. And that productivity needs, if anything, more spending, more support. The issue is that that money is not available. So we have to leave what we have and prioritize expenditure in order to support productivity. And what are the priorities there, if you ask me? Health and education, labor productivity. Thank you.
Much. I think for me, all the questions have been answered, I believe. But I would like to make, maybe I can just say 2 takeaways that I think are critical and which I agree with. One is low productivity. I think we are all agreeing there's low productivity. And what do we do about it? We shall be having a session just for that, so I'm not going to go into it. The second thing is public sector efficiency, or lack of it, whatever you want to call it. And I think we all agree, even the government agrees, that there is that need to improve. And already, you know, there's been a review, restructuring, and reducing government departments and agencies. The process is going on. And then lastly, we are not overspending, in my opinion. We are consolidating. Our fiscal deficit has been coming down. In fact, if you look at our expenditure as a ratio of GDP, it is not higher than many countries. It is real, but the real problem seems to be where we put the money. And I think that's the other lesson, or that's where we should focus. So that's it. Thank you very much, and look forward to the next session. Maurice, I think, is going to take over from me from now. Thank you.
Thanks.
Doctor, the photographer had requested, and I think I'll get out of the way, Isabella, please come back, that you will come to the front for your panel and have one panel photo session. So the cameraman, I only have 2 minutes. I think you'll have to do it at the front of this, otherwise this will hide. So please be careful at the front here. I'll just walk away and use your microphone on the other side. All right. So, ladies and gentlemen, can we give them another round of applause? Again, apologies. I know a lot of you would have been. So, thank you very much, Doctor and team, and all the other doctors on the panel. You now have to be very careful today because almost everyone coming to speak is a doctor. So, when you're referring to some of your neighbors, please start with the doctor. You're safer starting with the doctor, then they'll tell you they are not doctors. I think that is safer. All right. So the Honourable Minister has guided, since it is his next session, that himself and the Executive Director IGC are going to guide us to a very short coffee break. It's 5 minutes. I don't know how you'll drink that coffee in 5 minutes, but try. And they said they will set the record. So when they return, I will start the next session. So the Honourable Minister and Lippi will lead us, Dr. Lippi, and make your way to coffee. The NOC team, if we can guide both the Honourable Minister and Doctor to the serving centre. We are having coffee in the foyer, just upstairs. Please pick your coffee quickly. If you can return with it, even better. But I want to start the next session in exactly 10 minutes, actually at 12:20. The Honourable Minister will be starting his next session, and I request humbly that we make our way. We want to thank our TV partners because the formal broadcast will end here, and the virtual platforms will remain available for our audiences who are online, but we are taking a very short 10-minute break, and we'll return into the hall and on air at 12:20.